Hey all, here are OS Reviews. In this video, we're taking a revisited look back at the Moto Razr 40 Ultra, also known as the Razr Plus 2023 version. So this is a device that's now approaching 2 years old, but surprisingly, the design language still seems quite modern, and that's because Motorola has kept this overall look for the now base versions of the Moto Razr, the 2024 and 2025 versions, also known as the Razr 50 and the Razr 60, adopting the design language and look of this once Ultra version of the phone that was supposed to be a little more premium compared to the base Razr 40 from 2 years ago looks something like this instead, having a much smaller cover display on the outside which could only show you some basic notification status, reminiscent of some of the earlier generations of the Samsung Galaxy Z Flip devices, especially the first gen model was just a tiny little screen there for showing time, acting as a viewfinder for the camera, that was later on of course increased in size but still not quite as functional as Motorola's implementation, having a much more significant display that can be used like a tiny phone or a compact size phone even if you aren't flipping it open, making it a little bit more practical and of course something that Samsung later adopted as well, starting with the Z Flip 5 and now with the Flip 7 having a almost edge-to-edge display kind of matching the design of the latest Motorola Razr devices as well, which for reference now looks something like this. So the screen going all the way to the corners measuring 4 inches for the cover display versus the 3.6-inch panel on the Razr 40 Ultra, as well as again the Razr 50 and also the Razr 60, all having the same size, roughly 3.6-inch display on the outside. So basically the more premium design now trickling down into the base model, which is more affordable. And for Motorola, it's been a bit of a comeback story, because back in 2019 when the first generation Razr came out, it leaned heavily on nostalgia, but it was a exclusive for Verizon Wireless, making it a little bit more limited in terms of if you wanted to use other carriers, as well as fetching a high price point coupled with a mid-range processor, the Snapdragon 710, that wasn't as competitive compared to the Samsung version, which was using more of a flagship Snapdragon 855, meant that the phone's performance didn't feel quite as zippy, despite also commanding a price tag that was very steep at the time of release, going for $1,500, which was kind of crazy for a first generation foldable. So at the time, the general consensus was Samsung perhaps had a bit of an edge in terms of their foldable devices, and for a couple of generations they had significant more success and popularity, especially globally, with more widespread release instead of tied to only one carrier. But fast forward 5 years later, and Motorola really hasn't given up on this compact foldable form factor. The Razr devices have gained significantly more traction and popularity. I've seen ads sprouting up everywhere, and again, their devices are becoming more affordable, available on more networks, surprisingly catching up for lost ground, in fact, even coming out a little bit on top when it comes to the value proposition. Since they were able to reuse many of these components in their later generation phones, we see the cost continuing to come down lower, making it more accessible than ever to get a foldable style phone, turning into a cycle because the phones are more affordable, more people are picking them up, and as a result, you can find them more easily, even on third-party platforms like eBay or Amazon for a reduced cost as well because of the larger inventory and availability. In fact, that's a big reason why I wanted to revisit this Razr 40 Ultra, because again, the design still looks quite clean and modern, but now you can find it at a street price which is around $200, which is actually kind of crazy for a phone that still has, in my opinion, very competitive specs. It's packing a 4nm TSMC manufactured Qualcomm Snapdragon 8 Plus Gen 1, still offering buttery smooth performance, which is thanks to the fast 144Hz refresh rate on the front OLED display, and then the inside has a even faster 165Hz display, which is LTPO, can dial down to just 1 Hz to consume even less power. So this is actually perhaps one of the now cheapest Snapdragon 8 Plus Gen 1 series phones that you can find. And what's even crazier is if you sort these listings by price from lowest to highest, you can now find certain units going for only $35. Granted, the units under $40 typically have a screen defect on the inside, but what's interesting about this foldable is because the front screen can run all of the same apps, you can still use it as a tiny compact phone even if you never touch the inside screen. You could literally pick up a $40 phone that has a Snapdragon 8 Plus Gen 1 in terms of performance and just use it like a tiny device that can fit in the palm of your hand, kind of a throwback to the days where compact phones were still more popular, and definitely something I miss, to be honest. So it really is a unique value proposition. It might be kind of a hack or workaround, maybe a little unsightly, but definitely something to consider because, again, the Razr 40 Ultra has a significantly more usable outer display than many of the other previous generation devices. Perhaps a use case that's been ignored by many folks out there, since, again, this format isn't really like a traditional phone where you have to rely on that main display in order to take advantage of the functionality and power inside of the device. Again, when folded shut, the phone's dimensions might be even slightly smaller than many of the mini and compact size phones as we knew it in the 2010s, for example, here side by side. And also, to Motorola's credit, I will say that their phones have always been quite playful in terms of colors as well as textures. You can see on all of the kind of related listings here, they really go through almost all the colors of the rainbow, from blues to reds to violets, and they have this partnership with Pantone to have these unique colors available, although you can also find it in a more conservative black that we have in front of us here. Now, one slight difference, though, is on the newer Razr 50, Razr 60, also known as the Razr 2024 and Razr 2025 versions. They have since switched from a Corning Gorilla Glass Victus, which is a frosted glass finish, over to a vegan leather finish or eco leather. This is also found on some of their Moto G devices, which, to be completely honest, I prefer the more practical fabric finish because it still feels quite premium, nice to grip, and also makes it harder to crack or damage, almost like having a case attached to the back of the phone. Additional finishes include a bamboo wood texture that is really a callback to the days of the Moto X line, which is both nostalgic as well as bring a bit more fun and customization back into smartphones, which have become so ubiquitous and uniform over the years. So I do like this splash of personality that Motorola is trying to do on some of their newer Razr devices. Here's also a final size comparison with the original kind of Moto Razr 2019 version, side by side, which had a fingerprint scanner on the front, having that chin finish. And so Motorola definitely leaned heavily on that nostalgia factor on the original release in terms of its design, which is admittedly still very cool to this day. Having this little notch on the top of the screen has always been a little controversial. Some people think it's unsightly, but on the original Moto Razr here, it actually fits into the design language they were going for, looking extremely cool. If only the performance was a little stronger for its time, and a few other weaknesses of this first generation device would be the battery life. It was very small at 2,500 milliamp hours, and so unfortunately, even though it was just a standard 60 Hz refresh rate screen, you could see the battery percentage kind of dropping minute by minute. It could barely last through a day of use before it just runs dry, compared to on the Razr 40 Ultra, thankfully upgrades to a more sizable 3,800 milliamp hour capacity battery, which supports faster 30-watt charging as well as Qi wireless charging support as well. And aside from the larger capacity, again, that 4nm processor is more efficient. You're able to just run it smoothly for longer without having any signs of overheating. The phone still remains cool in your hands. And especially if you rely more on the smaller cover screen, it can easily get you through at least a day and a half, in my experience, if not sometimes even 2 days before I had to recharge it again, because the processor here is so efficient, which is great. And on newer versions of the Moto Razr line, they have further upgraded the battery capacity to now be around 4,500 milliamp hours on the Razr 60 because it is powered by a silicon carbon battery inside as opposed to the more traditional lithium ion. So they can pack in a higher density cell in the same size or dimensions as a traditional battery, further increasing the capacity, which is really impressive. And so finally we're getting to a stage where a foldable phone doesn't mean a compromise on battery life anymore, lasting usually as long as a candy bar phone. Again, not too surprising since the battery capacity is now catching up to almost the same point as well. So yeah, the much stronger battery life as well as smoothness of the phone is perhaps the biggest thing I observed coming from the original Moto Razr Foldable to this Razr 40 Ultra, also known as the Razr Plus in the US, a little bit confusing. which is essentially the Razr 40 and the 40 Ultra in international markets. And speaking of, the US configuration of this phone comes with 8GB of RAM, which I also think is more than sufficient to still get by with smooth multitasking, and comes with 256GB of built-in storage by default, which is also good enough, I think, for most folks. However, this phone does not have any expandable storage. There is still a SIM card or nano SIM card slot in addition to virtual eSIM, but it doesn't have a hybrid memory expansion functionality, which is a little bit of a shame in that department. However, there is a slightly higher end 512GB version in terms of storage that also comes with 12GB of RAM if you're picking up an unlocked international version. And then the third biggest improvement compared to the original Moto Razr, I would say, is the hinge, now having more dynamic, unlimited angles that you can pop it open at. Again, rivaling the design that you have on the aforementioned Samsung Galaxy Z Flips, which also have a tighter hinge that you can use it as a mini laptop mode, popping it up to take some images, for example, with the camera acting as a small tripod, providing you with a little bit more flexibility and versatility in terms of positioning. This is compared to the original Moto Razr 2019. Actually, the hinge could only be completely opened or completely shut. There is no in-between. As you can tell, it just kind of bounces back if you're trying to hold it at an in-between point. So it's a slightly more versatile system there. That being said, even on the Razr 2019, Motorola already had a pretty sizable cover display, which measured 2.6 inches. So the ability to run some more applications on the cover screen was something that Motorola has always been doing. It's just on the newer devices, the screen size has further increased. Although one thing to consider is part of the screen is technically wrapping over the primary lens here. And so when it comes to usable screen size, yes, it is stretching around 3.6 inches or 4 inches diagonally on the newer devices, but part of that is still going to be obstructed by that camera cutout. So here's an example looking at some screenshots. You can see part of the image might be covered up by the lens and some maybe text elements as well. So you can actually long hold on the home section here to make the screen pop up a little bit and not really cover up the camera lens. And because it is a OLED display, when the pixels are not being emitted, it is completely dark. Actually, it doesn't look like there's a screen here at all. There's just a smaller kind of notification or ticker display area on the side instead, kind of splitting into two sections, and the main screen here becomes uninterrupted. But now as a result, this main display is actually not dramatically larger than the Moto Razr 2019, which didn't have any cutouts at all. So just something to keep in mind in terms of practical or usable screen size, even though it does look extremely modern, don't get me wrong. So the point is, it's a very usable cover display, which looks beautiful even 2 years later. Also, if you're holding it in this position, it becomes more of a kind of narrow and tall display, similar to a normal candy bar style phone. So it's actually quite interesting. You can play around with these different aspect ratios right on the cover display. Again, quite fun and playful with all the different ways you can use this thing. Otherwise, speaking of those two camera cutouts, it is technically one more lens versus, again, the OG 2019 Razr. It's now a 12 megapixel primary lens and also a 13 megapixel ultra wide, which has roughly a 108 degree field of view, getting you more within the frame of the shot. That being said, the camera performance is not going to be a highlight, I would say, on really any of these flip style folding phones. I mean, they're perfectly serviceable, especially with all the developments in computational photography, with phone processing doing a lot of the heavy lifting, applying tricks like HDR, for example, and it will definitely get you by without any problems. In fact, for taking selfies, it's still a very high quality lens. It's just compared to flagship normal candy bar style phones, typically having slightly more space to put a larger camera sensor. So the primary lens on here is a 1/2.55 inch type, which is, again, still quite comparable to some Digicam cameras from many years ago, usually having 1/2.3 inch, but better hardware combined with software can take things to the next level even more, such as on some 1-inch type sensors on normal phones, having a significantly more surface area for the sensor here to collect light and get you more bokeh, depth of field, dynamic range, even naturally because of the physics. But on here, it's not bad. As long as you don't expect it to be the latest iPhone Pro Max or non-folding flagship phone camera, I think you'll still be mostly pleased with the performance that this camera can churn out. In fact, that means if you wanted to, for some added fun, you can even hold the phone here in this half-folded tent mode, almost like a camcorder, recording videos as you're holding it in a form something like this, giving it another retro throwback vibe, again, compared to camcorders of yesteryear that you can hold in kind of a similar position. So yeah, definitely quite playful, and what it lacks in camera sensor, it kind of makes up in all of the versatile, fun shooting positions that it delivers. Plus, again, with camcorders, many of those have swiveling screens, and you can kind of simulate a equivalent experience, in fact, with the cover screen can still be activated while you are recording and giving you better composition for someone on the other side to see if they're within the frame or not as well. Otherwise, the inside screen measures nearly 7 inches diagonally. Again, it's another OLED panel with pretty minimal bezels, and overall the crease on the inside of the screen is also, I think, handled quite well. In fact, I will say maybe it's a little bit more seamless compared to some of the Samsung Galaxy Z Flip devices we've seen in the past. So this is what that screen looks like compared to, again, the Samsung Galaxy Z Flip here side by side, having a slightly deeper divot there as part of the screen that becomes a little bit more seamless on some of the Motorola Razr devices, a bit more of a wider radius as part of the hinge, even if we're looking at it sideways here at the same angle, as you can tell. So I think it's handled pretty well on Motorola's part. It's not too distracting. And you'll also see the front-facing selfie camera on the inside, which is 32 megapixels. Definitely not bad. And the hardware, in fact, still feels quite premium even 2 years later. Not too surprising because it was once a flagship device. Again, crafted out of Corning Gorilla Glass Victus, as well as an aluminum frame, some stainless steel as well, reinforcing it. Very shiny and feeling very solid, and also extremely slim, which is a trademark on all of these kind of folding style phones, because once you fold it in half, obviously the thickness will double. And so they have to control the thickness to make sure that it still feels comfortable when you are folding it shut, meaning that when you are using it in an open position like this, it's actually going to be one of the slimmest phones available, kind of like the recent Samsung Galaxy Edge smartphone, although that one isn't a foldable device. So I think it makes a little bit more sense on a form factor like this. That being said, the frame is extremely shiny, kind of wrapped in chrome, including the cover screen section is also treated with a mirror finish, as you can tell, which I guess can be used as a vanity mirror, but it does attract fingerprints and smudges a little bit more easily, as just a side note. Otherwise, on the bottom of the phone, you'll find access to a USB Type-C port, again for charging and data transfer. That being said, this particular port does not provide display output. That's also matching what we saw on the Samsung Galaxy Z Flip devices to date. There is no desktop mode or DeX mode support there. However, Motorola does have a wireless kind of desktop mode support, so you can screencast to a compatible smart TV or wireless screen and access a kind of Android desktop experience that we'll see later in this video as well, which is, I guess, one feature that is technically missing on some of its rivals, even though it's not using a wired connection, which would be even lower in terms of latency. The Razr does have built-in stereo speakers, however there is no 3.5mm headphone jack, kind of the norm these days. We have a built-in volume rocker as well as a power key with an integrated fingerprint scanner, which is thankfully extremely fast and reliable. Just the lightest tap will unlock it, no problems there, and then nothing else really on the other side. So a pretty clean overall finish. Even in the folded position, I would say the thickness is actually still quite manageable. It doesn't feel difficult at all to use because of the square form factor. In fact, here is next to some other compact size phones from the 2000s, like this other Motorola Linux powered smartphone. You can actually see that side by side, the thickness is actually pretty much on par with one another. So yeah, the point is it's really not that bad, and also the hinge does fold pretty much completely flat. You won't find any gap like on some of the previous generation Galaxy Z Flips, for example, where perhaps a bit more lint can get through as part of the hinge design. That said, the profile is still relatively similar to the original Moto Razr when it comes to thickness, as you can see there side by side. And I guess the original one does have kind of a textured Kevlar-like backing, which again I think might be a little bit more of a practical material choice, even if frosted glass might be perhaps more premium feeling to some, but it is more fragile. Similar to vegan leather or eco leather, this is something that I kind of prefer a little bit more, to be honest, but again, it is what it is. Still looks quite clean, although I would say the original Moto Razr definitely has a bit more of a charming design, just because it is so clearly a callback to the original Moto Razr in terms of all its design touches, that it's adding to the cool factor in my opinion, compared to the newer generation Razrs, including the Razr 40, 50, 60s, are all a bit more modern, streamlined phones, super sleek and stylish, but not quite as retro looking in that sense, more in line with what Samsung as well as Huawei and Oppo are doing with their foldables as well. Remaining a very comfortable experience, haptic vibration motors on the phone also feel pretty tight and responsive, And the UI here kind of reminds me of a smart watch in terms of you have different pages and widgets in this carousel to swipe through compared to the traditional Android launcher on the larger inner screen. For example, the second page over here is going to be the full list of applications. You're also able to hide, delete any applications from here, add more commonly used apps over. Furthermore, swiping again goes into a calendar view, checking out any important dates as well as notifications. Swiping again goes into a weather widget that tells you the current highs and lows as well as a couple of days ahead, wind speeds, and then swiping again will go into a kind of music mode, which will play back some popular tracks currently, taking advantages of services like Spotify to also show some cover art information, looking quite good. Another tab over is going to be specifically designed for games, tap and go style, and again, one more for contacts, one more here for stocks that you can look at, and additional one here for customizable widgets. I have a screen time widget here, but I can also add other utility tools from popular apps I have on the phone before going into the main home screen. So it just loops back and forth, working quite nicely. And then all of the UI elements, including the clock here, can all be customized as well. So the panels you're able to delete or rearrange in terms of their order, as well as add additional ones, including one for stopwatch, timer functionality. If you find these to be useful, you can pop them onto the carousel. And in terms of that lock screen, you're also able to find even more themes and packages available. Almost cartoon-like, extremely adorable, other ones which are more classy. You're able to customize the way the device looks and feels, adding a bit more to the style points. In fact, on this one, it looks like every time that we turn off the screen and wake it up again, it changes dynamically in terms of the background wallpaper. Certain wallpapers are also interactive and dynamic, like this one tries to simulate slime when you're pressing on it, pretty satisfying. And another little icon down below here will tell you any notifications that you can actually peek into, and you can read the entire message when you unlock the phone. So yeah, I think Motorola have done a pretty good job. You can also swipe down to access shortcuts for things like screen brightness. Again, the cover screen can even reach over 1,100 nits, making it readable even when there's some light hitting on it. You're able to turn on and off all the wireless controls. Like any flagship, you'll find the usual NFC, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, GPS controls on here, as well as 5G connectivity. And also the phone is splash resistant, so if it gets a little bit wet from rain, it will still survive. However, the 40 Ultra isn't rated for submersion, so as long as you don't dive into a pool with it, you should still be mostly fine. And returning briefly to that cover screen mode, even the icons in terms of how you want the font to be rearranged can all be customized as well. So it really provides a plethora of ways to customize the way that the device looks and feels, and just a couple more to serve as quick examples. And as you can see here for the wallpapers, once you unlock the phone, some of these designs also take advantage of the camera punch-out, like this one here having clever binoculars as part of the design. Very cute. Reminds me of the Samsung Galaxy S10e, which also tried to do the same thing, showing a little bit more attention to detail. Otherwise, you're also able to pinch out from here to quickly access the full card view, jumping into a specific widget if you don't want to go through the entire carousel. This might make it a little bit faster, as you can tell there. We're able to swipe up here to go into a multitasking view, and again, the 8GB of RAM I think is doing a pretty solid job. Even if you have a couple of apps open at the same time, it still juggles between them relatively quickly. So again, web browsing still feels quite smooth and responsive on this particular phone. It's not too surprising because the 8 Plus Gen 1 is still a very capable chipset that can outperform many mid-range processors easily here in 2025. And that is another point of difference, I would say, compared to the regular Motorola Razr 40 as well as Razr 50, the base version of this phone, instead uses a MediaTek Dimensity processor, which to MediaTek's credit has also improved by leaps and bounds, but it's still not quite as performant as the flagship TSMC manufactured Snapdragon equivalent, so it still has a bit of an advantage in terms of raw performance power, and we see that in terms of the fluidity as well as responsiveness when it comes to navigation. Typing using the cover display is also not that bad. You can also rely on swipe if desired, in addition to using voice input instead, but in general, it just takes a little of acclimation since the width of the screen is still about the same as a normal-sized phone. And the more square aspect ratio actually renders itself a little bit closer to a kind of newspaper article in terms of the layout. And I guess this is why the iPad has a more boxy 4:3 aspect ratio as well. Actually reading back articles and web pages, surprisingly not that bad in terms of usability, still quite comfortable. As you can tell here, sharpness is also not a problem. It is a full HD resolution display. Let's also jump into YouTube to demonstrate video playback and what the speakers sound like. So turning the volume down there, a couple of takeaways would be it does indeed have the aforementioned stereo speakers, which are actually not bad in terms of overall depth as well as immersiveness, actually having a little bit more bass, a touch more than I was expecting. So in terms of sound quality, definitely not shabby from the built-in speakers. And yes, the video will continue where you last left off as well. So there's continuity between the outer and inner screens as you switch back and forth. It knows to resume at the same point. And then just like the aforementioned Samsung Galaxy Z Flip devices, when you are using it in a folded form, kind of a laptop or tent mode, the UI also automatically aligns to place the video on top and then some controls on the bottom. Also, Motorola software continues to offer additional mini app support as well, so you can have the applications work as floating windows, kind of similar to Sony Xperia phones as well. You can rearrange these flexibly and position them anywhere in the screen. Also, for doing a bit more multitasking, if you want to run two applications side by side, maybe one app at the top, one app at the bottom, that's going to be feasible using the inside screen as well. Again, some of these ideas, which might have been borrowed or inspired by Samsung and Sony, have been kind of consolidated into Motorola's software as well, which is not bad. It's pretty polished feeling at this point. Motorola continues to support their kind of legacy gestures, including a chop motion to activate a flashlight. You can turn this on or off, as well as a twist motion there to instantly jump into the camera. Are some examples of gestures carried over, not to mention always on display mode, taking advantage of the OLED screen, double tap to wake are all other functions that you'll find here as well. That being said, speaking of the software experience, even though it does feel quite clean and polished, it has 3 official OS level updates from Motorola's part. So it came originally with Android 13, so it's guaranteed to receive Android 16 as its last OS version upgrade, which is at least better than in the past where they might have only provided 2 years of support. However, it's also shy of what Samsung as well as Google Pixels now offer, giving you upwards of 4 to 6 years of software support, trying to rival what Apple provides on their iPhones. Longer term support is always better, and hopefully as the popularity and success of the Moto Razr line continues to grow, something that Motorola can consider as well. Since these are no longer niche phones like they once were on the first generation, they're becoming more mainstream. But it is what it is. Even if Android 16 is the last version, you can obviously still install all of the latest applications that you would want to from the Google Play Store. Here's also a quick demo of recording a voice memo. This is basically what the microphone quality will sound like, which can also be used even when the phone is closed. Demo of recording a voice memo. This is basically what the microphone quality will sound like, which can also be used even when the phone is closed. Having some wind and noise cancellation as well. So if you're making phone calls, it actually sounds quite clean, very legible, and also the slightly taller aspect ratio once you have it fully opened up actually makes it quite comfortable as you're making physical calls. Microphone's a little bit closer to your mouth as well. So no issues there. Antenna reception quality in the Seattle region also wasn't too problematic. I was consistently getting around 3 to 4 bars for both cellular using AT&T as well as Wi-Fi support. So no issues in terms of staying connected, which is good to see. Even doing a little bit of light gaming with a couple of applications really optimized to take advantage of this cover screen's aspect ratio, like this maze example here that uses haptic vibrations as well to give you a buzz as you're hitting a wall here of the maze, and then using the accelerometer Kind of fun, and you'll see an animation sprout out from there as well. Some of these first title games are actually developed by Motorola as mini games if you are really bored, just to play on the cover display. Yet another example is called Catch Moto Moo, and once you are aligned, you're able to then try and drag on one of the pieces. This one's actually a little bit challenging, but the objective is to catch some of these falling pieces, completing all of the ones that you see in the puzzle in order to kind of beat the game. And then yet another one is called Astro Odyssey. So this one here is another kind of tap and run style game. Objective here is to avoid any obstacles that pop up and run faster and faster. Kind of like Dino, which is the game you get built into Chrome when there's no Wi-Fi or internet available. Pretty similar here. So casual style of games, although the phone itself, again with the Snapdragon 8 Plus Gen 1, is still very much capable of running heavier, even AAA style games like PUBG, Asphalt, Minecraft can all perform on here, Genshin Impact, with no problems at all. Yes, if you're comparing it with an even newer flagship or a gamer phone, you can find additional performance bumps in terms of fluidity, especially on some devices that have more RAM. But for casual gaming, it's more than serviceable. There's really no application from the store that you aren't able to run smoothly on this phone, not too surprising because of the specs that it's packing underneath. Although if you are pressing it really hard with intensive AAA gaming, it will get a little bit warmer on the back. But generally speaking, thermal management has been handled quite well in my opinion, especially for a thin and light device like this. And for everyday navigation, again, watching videos, browsing around, it still remains cool to the touch. So yeah, it's a pretty powerful cover display as it is, and intuitive, easy enough to use. Perhaps if they added an option to unlock the full Android experience, again, mirroring what the inside screen gives you on this outer screen completely, including some of the Google Newsfeed applications, the ability to choose any application to run on here versus just the core essential ones that you have here, I think that could make it even more versatile and powerful. Here's another example of an app which may be having more icons and complicated layout that requires you to flip open this phone in order to use it. Honestly, just rescale to fit into the smaller size screen. Maybe if you're flipping it over like this, instead of requiring you to open it, giving you that choice would have been nice. But again, it is what it is. Taking a look at the desktop mode next, again, there's actually two ways you can choose. The first is screencasting to a wireless TV or display, similar to Chromecast or Miracast. The second way is actually you can download an app if you have a Windows PC, and the app allows you to also have the desktop experience mirrored on it, basically connecting the phone to the computer wirelessly. So if you're in the office and your monitor doesn't have Chromecast or Miracast, you can still use it with the Smart Connect app installed on the PC. So this is what it looks like. It does have a, again, more Samsung DeX inspired layout versus the mobile optimized view on the smartphone itself. We have a menu bar on the side to see the full list of applications. Now again, compared to a wired desktop mode, animations are going to be a little more choppy because it's being sent wirelessly, but it's still usable, I would say. We're able to open up all the same applications we have installed on our phone on a larger screen. In fact, if we tap on Recorder, you can see it's a resizable window that we can drag around more flexibly, which makes sense with a mouse and keyboard layout. Similarly, we can access, again, Chrome browser, and once again, we have floating windows like on a regular computer that we're able to get some work done with. So if you're doing some Google Docs, file management work, actually makes it a little bit more versatile and flexible using a mode like this with multitasking and rearrangeable windows. We can also take screenshots, check out the battery status info, although I will say, compared to Samsung DeX, which maybe pops up as a small window at the bottom section of the bar, this one actually still opens up the settings drawer within Android, which is not quite as optimized for this particular animation, but overall it still is functional, I would say, showing a little bit more attention to detail. And yes, you can actually run this while the phone screen is turned off as well. So right now, as we're using the desktop mode, the phone, as you can tell here, is actually completely dark, so it doesn't actually consume power with the phone screen. And in this demo, we are using it with the Smart Connect app on a PC, so you can see that the window is further going to be resizable on this computer monitor. Furthermore, there's a couple of other applications you can leverage with the connected device. For example, there's also a phone on PC mode, which instead will mirror the phone screen directly on the side of your computer, as you can tell there, instead of having the desktop specific optimized view. So if you wanted to, you can access a experience that looks something like this instead, which is more of that mobile view that we're used to on the inner display of the phone. Again, accessing the same applications that we have installed on the phone, In fact, there's another virtual phone mode that you can trigger, which is going to be disjointing the virtual screen from the actual phone screen. So for example, on the phone here, I can be running another app altogether, whereas on the computer screen, I'm still getting that mobile interface instead of desktop mode, but I can be looking at something completely different as a separate instance. Aside from these mirroring modes, you can also access a webcam mode, which will use the higher quality cameras on the phone instead of the webcam built into your laptop. Alternatively, you can stream specific applications and have them pop up on the larger screen here. Instead of opening up the entire desktop or mobile experience, some shortcuts for specific apps can be found, in addition to transferring files back and forth. There's smart clipboarding functions for copying text and images between the PC and phone. So drag and drop file transfer is going to be a benefit here, even accessing mobile data and letting your laptop use the hotspot from your phone. So yeah, really not bad, giving you access to just some of those quick connectivity functions using the desktop interface. Last but not least, in the companion software, there's also universal search. This can be for any application or file name, and you can find the relevant information more quickly. So there we have it. That is more or less it as far as our closer look at the Motorola Razr 40 Ultra, again also known as the Razr Plus in the US market. 2 years later, I would say this phone has held up really well and offers a extremely compelling value proposition. Foldable phones are no longer prohibitively expensive, and you're not compromising too much on battery life or performance anymore, thanks to the, again, fast and performant Snapdragon 8 Plus Gen 1 chip, which still flies and feels extremely fluid and fast to this day. Pretty crazy that you can pick up a device like this for just around $200, or if you're willing to go with the whole DIY approach, you can even find some in the super bargain territory of under $50, using it exclusively as a compact mini-sized phone, which is kind of insane to see in my opinion. But anyways, definitely is still a pretty cool and fun device to check out, feeling just a little bit different. You can check out more details if interested in the links down below. For now, that's been our video. Thanks for watching here at OS Reviews. That has been the surprisingly now very good value Motorola Razr 40 Ultra in 2025.